The most significant ideas in games don't necessarily come from what you add or how you make a game look or even how difficult you make a game. Sometimes it comes from what you try to simulate. Not just bigger worlds, not just better graphics, but systems that feel like they exist, whether you're there or not. Characters with routines, worlds that react, moments that aren't scripted but happen because everything underneath them is working together. Because that's the dream, right? Not just to play in a world, but to believe it's alive. In the early 2000s, Bethesda set out to build exactly that. Not just a bigger Elder Scrolls game, but one that could take everything they had learned from Arena to Daggerfall to Morrowind and push it into something that felt more real, more reactive, and more accessible than anything they had ever made before. The result was Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, a game that didn't just expand the series, but helped define what a modern open world role playing game could become. Today, we're exploring how Oblivion was built, the decisions that shaped it, and the impact those choices had on the industry and series that followed. Join us as we step through the gates of Cyrodiil on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 290th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we are looking at Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, yet another Elder Scrolls title in the series. We've covered quite a few, but this one was definitely, in a lot of ways, a game changer for the series. It simplified it for mainstream audiences and just turned the series, increased its popularity heads over tails, basically. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, my brother, what are we, Rob? Are we teammates?
More like acquaintances on the same team.
We're just acquaintances too.
Yep.
Yeah, my co-host, my acquaintance, sometimes my brother, I guess, Rob Casson. Rob, let me ask you this, something a little different. Open world question. If you were dropped into a world where everyone had their own routines, their own goals, and things could happen whether or not you were there, are you following the story? Like, are you following their lives? Or are you just kind of doing your own thing without any consideration for everyone else? Like, how do you
Well,
open world games?
I kind of try to go around and do a little bit of everything until I get bored of it, and then just focus on the main thing that I got to get getting. God damn, main
Mhm.
thing I got to get to getting.
Are you a fan of big, giant open world games?
I am, except that it feels like a lot after some time. So that's why I've never beaten Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, any of the Elder Scrolls that I've played. I get that. I don't know what the word I'm looking for, or the phrase. I'm sure there is exactly one that's explaining what I feel, but I just like it becomes too much.
So you're one of those that starts out with all the gusto in the world, wanting to do absolutely everything, and then at some point you just lose steam and the game just gets put down.
Absolutely, Dave.
Yeah, a lot of people get overwhelmed that way. I know quite a few people that are like that. Have you played Oblivion?
I just described exactly to you what happened when I played it.
Oh, so Oblivion is one of the titles.
Yes, more so, the sequel, but I did pick up Oblivion after playing the sequel because I'm like, you know what? Let's see where it kind of got started a little more so in this direction.
That valid reason to pick up Oblivion. Oblivion was so I've talked about it on this podcast before. The first Elder Scrolls game I was ever introduced to was Morrowind, but I picked up Morrowind and got overwhelmed by it, couldn't figure it out, put it down for a lot of the reasons that we're going to talk about today, actually. And I revisited the series with Oblivion here when I got my Xbox 360, and I pretty sure I've completed every bit of Oblivion. Like this is one game that every side quest I could find, every mission, all the DLC, I think I've thoroughly explored this world. This was the first Elder Scrolls game that really grabbed me. So in a lot of ways, I consider this like my like initiation into the Elder Scrolls series. And I think that was the case for a lot of people. We'll talk about that more too. But before I get into a little bit of the history of Elder Scrolls, into Oblivion and beyond, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
Alrighty, well, kicking it off, it was on March 16th, 1990, when Yonoid was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, starring Domino's Pizza's mascot and a licensed platforming adventure. Developed by Capcom, the game was actually a reskinned version of the Japanese title Kamen no Ninja Hanamaru, adapted to feature the Noid as he battled enemies and navigated obstacle-filled stages to protect pizza deliveries. Yonoid stood out as a quirky example of late 1980s brand tie-ins with gaming. And while not a major critical success, it remains a memorable oddity from the era, reflecting a time when mascots and marketing campaigns often crossed directly into video game design.
We kind of talked about that in our advertisement episode. We talked about it recently too. What were we talking about recently? We talked about
I believe it
another
was with was it
Pepsi Man.
no? Well, it was Pepsi Man, yeah, but I thought it was with one of your buddies that we just did an episode with.
Yeah, I mean it was with Ryan, but I
Yeah,
think
okay, I thought it was Ryan.
I think that we got onto it because we were talking about Pepsi Man in this exact segment. We got into back into the advertisement episode, advert game episode. I don't remember what the
Yeah, Advert
phrase
Games
is.
is yeah.
And
Yeah, no, it was definitely the last episode. I actually believe it was last episode because that's the one we did with Ryan, and I
Yo
talked about the
Noid,
Lego Island game.
Yo Noid. That was a weird game. So weird.
Well, it was just as weird as Kamen no Ninja Hanamaru.
That it was valid point. I'm right with you on that one.
Next up for this week in gaming history, on March 19th, 1994, Super Metroid was released for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan, setting a new standard for atmospheric exploration in video games. Developed and published by Nintendo, the game followed bounty hunter Samus Aran as she returned to planet Zeeves to recover a stolen Metroid larva. Building on its predecessors, Super Metroid refined nonlinear progression, environmental storytelling, and ability based exploration, allowing players to uncover secrets at their own pace. Its minimalist narrative, haunting soundtrack, and interconnected world design created a deeply immersive experience. And while regarded as one of the greatest games of all time, Super Metroid helped define the Metroidvania genre and continues to influence game design decades later.
I recently did Super Metroid. Actually, by the time this publishes, it'll be the day of the video for that day is Super Metroid. And so I went back through gameplay of Super Metroid and I forgot, and I do this every so often because I'll go a few years in between playing it. I forgot how like absolutely excellent that game is just for like the atmosphere, the sound, the gameplay. That is easily one of the best games ever. Period. I was going to say let alone its time, but it just gets me every time I look at it or play it or anything like that. I'm going to have to play through it again basically.
Well, I can't say I blame you there, Dave.
Excellent choice.
Excellent indeed. Next up for this week, on March 15th, 2001, Fallout Tactics Brotherhood of Steel was released for PC, offering a different take on the post apocalyptic world of the Fallout series. Developed by Microforte and published by Interplay Entertainment, the game shifted focus from open ended role playing to squad based tactical combat. Players commanded a team of Brotherhood of Steel soldiers across missions that emphasized strategy, positioning, and resource management rather than traditional dialogue driven progression. While it lacked the narrative depth and player choice of earlier Fallout titles, Fallout Tactics was praised for its challenging gameplay and expanded look at the Brotherhood faction. Its departure from the series' core formula made it a unique, if divisive, entry into the broader Fallout timeline.
Have you ever gotten into tactical strategy games
Oh,
like XCOM?
absolutely, Dave. I actually remember that when I first built my PC back in 2012, 2013, one of my favorite games was this tactical based shooter. It was, in the desert, and you had to like hide around these buildings and kill the enemy team, obviously. But it was all about like positioning and strategy and flanking, and it was just a lot of fun.
What, like a Commando series game?
Um, I mean, are you talking not no, not Command and Conquer? Maybe I've never played Commandos, only Command and Conquer, but that's not really the same.
No, I
So,
gotcha. All
um,
right,
but maybe. I like I said, it was one of my most played games when I first built my computer, so I'd
awesome.
play that for hours. So yes, I am a fan. So Fallout Tactics, I'll give it a whirl. Speaking of games that are worth giving a whirl, on March 15th, 2004, Battlefield Vietnam was released for PC, bringing the large scale warfare of the Battlefield series to a new historical setting. Developed by DICE and published by Electronic Arts, the game shifted from World War II to the Vietnam War, introducing dense jungles, asymmetrical combat, and a heavy emphasis on vehicles like helicopters and patrol boats. Building on the foundation of Battlefield 1942, it expanded multiplayer gameplay with class based roles, coordinated team objectives, and a memorable soundtrack featuring era specific music that could be played in vehicles. Praised for its atmosphere and multiplayer depth, Battlefield Vietnam helped solidify the series' identity as a leader in large scale team based shooters, and still probably the leader to this day.
it was it was an excellent sequel to 1942. We came out when we were in college. We all had a lot of fun. We had a lot of fun with that, playing that across the dorms for sure.
Oh, absolutely, and I believe that was one of the ones I also joined you with from afar,
That is true.
because that game was the shiznit.
That game was a lot of fun. A
I
lot of
mean, let's
fun.
be real. There's very few Battlefield titles that aren't great. One,
True statement. Well, there's been a few modern recent ones that have been a little lackluster, but the
I
classics.
can't think of one that you would refer to, Dave.
Nothing at all.
Not one.
Not at all.
Jokes over your head.
Hmm.
Last up for this week in gaming history, on March 17th, 2012, Pokemon Conquest was released in Japan for the Nintendo DS, offering a unique crossover between the Pokemon series and Koei Tecmo's Nobunaga's Ambition. Developed by Koei Tecmo and published by Nintendo, the game transported players to the feudal inspired Ransei region, where warlords partnered with Pokemon to conquer rival kingdoms. Departing from traditional Pokemon gameplay, Pokemon Conquest featured grid based tactical battles emphasizing positioning, type advantages, and strategic planning. Its blend of historical themes and monster collecting mechanics created a distinctly different experience within the franchise. And while it remained a one off collaboration, Pokemon Conquest is remembered as a creative experiment that successfully merged two very different styles of gameplay. Actually, sounds like a lot of fun. I wish I could pick up a copy of that. Maybe I'll have to see if there's a chance.
Yeah, it was definitely a Pokemon title I was unfamiliar with, which is exactly why I chose it.
Well, that's fair, but I don't think people are here to talk about Pokemon today, even though I know probably a lot of our fans would. They're here for a different reason, Dave. So why don't you take it away and let's get on the story of Oblivion?
Bethesda didn't arrive at this point in history at Oblivion as the role playing giant that we think of today. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, it was a studio that was still trying to figure out what it wanted to be. And in the beginning, if you'll recall, they were making sport games, football, hockey, basketball. They were dabbling in licensed titles like The Terminator and Home Alone. Not really what you think about when you think about Bethesda, not the foundation that you think about when you think about Bethesda. But that all started to change when the team wanted to try something different, right? The idea was simple enough at first. They sought out to make a medieval style gladiator game. You travel from city to city, fighting in arenas, working your way up to become the grand champion of the empire. But as they built that idea out, something interesting happened. The side quests started to become more compelling than the arenas. The world between the fights started to matter more than the fights themselves. And slowly, that gladiator game became something else entirely. That became the Elder Scrolls Arena, the first game in the series, which was released in 1994. Now, we've dug really deep into that story before and into Bethesda's early history. So, if you want the full breakdown of Arena and the studio itself, we did all that in episode 187. So, you can find that in our archives. We'll cover that whole journey in a whole lot more detail there. But for today, I thought we'd stick to the highlights just to kind of see how we got to where we're at now. From there, Bethesda leaned all the way in. With Daggerfall, the second Elder Scrolls game in 1996, they doubled down on scale, creating a world so massive that it became legendary. There were thousands of towns, hundreds of thousands of NPCs, and a map so large that it could take literal real world days to cross. But there was a trade off, right? It was a game that was ambitious but rough. It was huge with plenty of emptiness to it. It was innovative, but also really messy at times. As the series began to evolve, one thing was becoming very clear. Bethesda wasn't trying to make tightly scripted role playing games, they were more or less trying to build worlds. These are worlds where players could go anywhere, do anything, and decide for themselves who they wanted to be. It's fair to say that by the end of the 1990s, they really genuinely had that philosophy locked in. But what they didn't have yet, realistically, was a game that would bring it all together. That turning point finally came in 2002 with the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. In Morrowind, Bethesda didn't just make a bigger game, they made a smarter one. Instead of chasing scale the way they had with Daggerfall, they pulled things back. Not in ambition, not in focus, but rather in how they crafted the game. Instead of building an entire continent, they centered everything on a single island called Vardenfell. And starting with Morrowind, everything was built by hand. Every town, every ruin, every path through the wilderness, it wasn't generated. It was placed, it was designed, it was thought through. And that one decision changed everything about how the world of Elder Scrolls felt. Because for the first time, Bethesda's worlds didn't just feel big, they started to feel real. What really made Morrowind stand out wasn't just how it was built, it was very much how different it was. Because this was a world that wasn't the familiar medieval fantasy setting that players were traditionally used to. There were no rolling green hills and stone castles, right? Instead, you had towering mushrooms, ash covered wastelands, insect like creatures that we use as transportation, and all these different cultures that felt completely foreign to us. It was a strange game, and that strangeness became part of its identity, became part of the Elder Scrolls identity. From the moment that game begins, it makes it clear, right? You arrive by boat, you're a prisoner released without much explanation, you're given a name, a few directions, and then you're left to figure things out for yourself. In Morrowind, there are no quest markers, no glowing paths, just a world and this expectation that you'll learn how to navigate it. And for a lot of players, that was magic. You could follow the main story, or you could completely ignore it. You could join guilds, explore ruins, read through hundreds of in game books, or just wander around and see what you could find. There were no mechanisms necessarily pushing you forward. They crafted a world that was all about just letting you exist in it. And that approach really connected with people in a big way. Morrowind was a critical and commercial success. It sold millions of copies, brought the series to consoles when they ported it over to the original Xbox, and very much proved that this kind of open ended RPG could reach a much, much wider audience. But that success came with a realization of sorts, because the same things that made Morrowind special were also the things that made it difficult for a lot of players to get into, myself included, right? I talked about how I couldn't figure it out and got lost with Morrowind. I never got into it because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And that was part of the design of the game, right? No quest paths, no guide. It was designed to just drop you in. Another example is the combat. Combat could feel awkward for people. You might swing your weapon, clearly hit an enemy on screen, and still miss because the animation and the mechanics didn't line up. Everything was calculated behind the scenes with dice roll style mechanics, like traditional role playing style. So the animation didn't really matter because you could still roll and not hit. It felt less like an action and more like math. And again, navigation, my personal hurdle. No quest markers, no map indicators, no clear waypoints. If an NPC told you to head north past a fork in the road and look for a rock shaped like a guar, that was your guidance. You either figured it out or you didn't. And of course, the world itself. As rich as it was, it could also feel static. NPCs mostly stood in place, repeating the same lines of dialogue. The traditional role playing experience from days of yore, right? The world didn't always feel like it was reacting to you. Heck, it didn't even feel like it was reacting to itself, to be fair. For some players, none of that mattered. To them, that was the charm, right? But for others, like I have described myself, it created a barrier. And Bethesda knew it. They heard the criticism, they recognized the criticism. Because by the time Morrowind launched, I don't think that they were trying just to make a great role playing game anymore. They were trying to make a mainstream role playing game. You know, taking it from PC and porting it over to Xbox, which was the big system at the time, that is trying to broaden your audience. That is trying to go mainstream. Morrowind was a game they were hoping could reach beyond the hardcore PC audience and connect with a much larger group of players, especially as consoles were all becoming more popular, powerful, and more important to the industry. So when development began on the next game, the goal wasn't just to build on to Morrowind. It was very much to rethink it with that all that criticism in mind. to take everything that worked, the freedom, the scale, the immersion, and combine it with something the series hadn't really fully achieved yet. Maybe accessibility, clarity, and very much in their minds, a world that didn't just exist, but felt more alive in a way that they weren't yet able to achieve. And really, that is where our topic for today, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, begins. Because when Bethesda started working on it, they weren't just building a sequel, they were building what they believed would be a next generation role playing game. Development on Oblivion began in 2002, literally right after Morrowind shipped. And from the very beginning, Todd Howard made the goal clear. He wanted to create something that combined the freedom of their previous games with technology that could finally make the world feel alive in a way that they'd only imagined before. And of course, the next gen had a lot to do with that because a big part of achieving that goal came down to hardware. For the first time, Bethesda was developing alongside new console technology, developing for what would become the Xbox 360 while still supporting PCs. And that shift alone changed how they approached almost everything. Because when you develop for a console, your menus need to be clearer, right? Your controls, in particular, your controller controls, have to feel more natural and intuitive. Information needs to be easier to understand at a glance because this is very much a game for players. This, if you're translating over to console, this is no longer a game designed for players that are just willing to read through pages of text and keep handwritten notes anymore. I'm not to say that console players don't do that, but console players are less likely to approach a game that way than PC players, right? Because you don't game at a desk where you can put paper down. Let's be honest about that.
Yeah, that's very true.
And so, right from the get go, Oblivion was a game meant for a wider audience. And in order to achieve that end, the team has to start rethinking systems because we're not looking at needing small tweaks. We're looking at fundamental changes at how the game literally feels in your hands for starters, right? Combat has to become more immediate. There has to be less of the dice rolls and more direct feedback to appeal to a wider audience. In Morrowind, again, every swing was calculated behind the scenes using stats and percentages. In Oblivion, Bethesda made a deliberate decision to tie combat more closely to what the player could actually see. If your sword connected, it hit. But that shift wasn't just about feel. It required reworking how animations, how hit detection, and physics all interacted in real time. To achieve this end, the team leaned real heavily into Havoc physics, which allowed the enemies to react dynamically instead of just playing canned animations. It made fights feel less like calculations and more like encounters. And also, let's be honest, like the ragdoll physics that comes along with the Havoc's engine, the real physics engine, is kind of freaking hilarious. It's a lot of fun.
I don't know it too well.
No, you never like laughed your butt off when you slayed an enemy in an Elder Scrolls game and it just, bounces or twists or does some weird things because of the physics engine.
Can't say I have, Dave.
Mm-hmm. Quest design saw an equally dramatic shift. Morrowind trusted players to figure things out. Oblivion aimed to guide them through the world. The addition of objective markers wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was a response to how players were actually engaging with other open world games, right? Because if you think about this time period, we're in the period of very much Grand Theft Auto. We'll use that example. And Grand Theft Auto had quest markers. Heck, Grand Theft Auto had GPS, and people loved that guidance, right? That you would be shown exactly where to go.
True.
And so that was a design element that was, again, pretty standard to open world games, very much appealed to a mainstream audience. And so it was time to bring it here. Bethesda had seen that many players loved the freedom of the open world, but they got lost in the friction, which I think is something that you and I have both spoken to, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So instead of removing exploration, they just layered clarity on top of it. You could still ignore the marker, but if you wanted the direction, it was there waiting for you. One of the most ambitious changes out of all of them is perhaps the dialogue, because Bethesda didn't just add voice acting, they committed to fully voicing every single character in the game. And that meant recording thousands of lines of dialogue, managing a relatively small pool of voice actors, and on top of that, building systems for facial animations and lip syncing that could work across an enormous number of interactions. The technology was limited, and so you do get moments in Oblivion where multiple characters sound suspiciously similar, but at the time, it was an absolute massive leap forward. It transformed conversations in the series from something you necessarily read into something you experienced. And then there was the system Bethesda couldn't stop talking about. And that's not even an exaggeration. I read dozens of interviews, you know, of people talking up Oblivion, and they would reference this over and over and over. And that would be Radiant AI. Radiant AI was Bethesda's attempt to simulate a living world. And not visually simulate a living world, but behaviorally simulate a living world. Instead of scripting every NPC, non player character by hand, Bethesda created a system where characters were given goals: eat, sleep, work, socialize, and the AI would decide how to fulfill those goals based on the world around them. So an NPC might go to a tavern because they're hungry. They might steal food if they can't afford it. They might get arrested or killed because of that action. And during development, frankly, that's exactly what started happening. NPCs would poison each other over food.
That's good.
Important quest characters would die unexpectedly. Entire systems would spiral into chaos because the AI was technically working, just not in any controlled way whatsoever.
That's wild.
In some cases, NPCs would again follow their needs so literally that it broke the game. Characters meant to give quests would wander off, get into fights, or disappear entirely. In one example that Bethesda shared, an NPC, again, who couldn't afford food simply stole it. That triggered the guards, which triggered violence, and suddenly an entire town's behavior chain unraveled from a single decision. So Bethesda had to scale it back. What shipped in Oblivion was a more restrained version of Radiant AI. It was structured enough to keep the game stable, but dynamic enough to make the world feel less static than anything they had ever built before. And when you take all of these things together, the voice acting, the quests, the Radiant AI, the control schemes, the combat, when you take it all and put all together, it genuinely becomes pretty clear what they were trying to do. You know, Rob, what I love about that is the idea of systems almost getting too real, you know? Like everything technically works, but it creates chaos instead of a playable experience.
Yeah, it's not enough for something. Yeah, it's not enough for something to function. It has to function in a way people can actually use.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's why I like using Zencaster. It gives you powerful tools, but it keeps everything structured so you're not fighting the system while you're trying to create.
So I don't end up with NPCs poisoning each other in the middle of my podcast?
Hopefully not. You just log in through your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There's no complicated setup, definitely no chaos behind the scenes.
But what if something goes wrong mid recording?
Well, Zencaster has multi-layered backups, so even if your connection drops, your recordings stay safe and the highest quality.
And editing?
Their post-production tools automatically remove background noise, trim filler words, and balance your audio. You can get a polished result without things spiraling out of control.
But once it's done, how do I get it out there?
Zencaster lets you distribute your podcast directly to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other major platforms, all from a single dashboard.
So controlled systems, not total chaos.
Exactly. And if you're interested in it, go over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any paid plan.
All right. So what were they actually trying to accomplish with all of this, Dave?
Well, that's really the question, isn't it? Because when the game finally released on March 21st, 2006, it didn't just answer that question. It showed whether those changes would translate into real success. And in a lot of ways, they did. Because Oblivion launched at a very specific moment in the industry, I think. You know, the Xbox had launched just 4 months earlier in November of 2005, and Microsoft was still looking for titles that could define what this new generation of hardware actually meant. And Oblivion became one of those titles. It was showcased heavily in the lead up to release, featured in Xbox 360 demo kiosks, highlighted across gaming media, and positioned as a game that could demonstrate large scale worlds, advanced lighting, and more dynamic systems than players had ever seen on consoles before. And with all that in mind, players showed up for it. Oblivion sold over 1.7 million copies within its first month. By the end of its first year, it had surpassed 3 million copies worldwide. And over time, that number would grow to approximately 9.5 million units sold across all of its platforms.
God damn, that's a lot.
I don't think there's anyone complaining about selling 9.5 million units.
I would hope not.
Critically, it performed just as strongly. The Xbox 360 version holds a 94 on Metacritic, with the PC version scoring similarly, placing it among the highest rated games of its generation, and went on to win multiple Game of the Year awards in 2006 and was frequently cited as one of the defining early titles of the Xbox 360 era. But that success didn't mean that everyone agreed with the direction of the game. One of the most discussed changes was how the game handled progression and its world balance. Bethesda had made a deliberate decision to implement level scaling across much of the game's world. So enemies, loot, and encounters would be adjusted based on the player's level. From a design perspective, the goal was really straightforward, right? You reduce frustration, you keep the experience consistent, and you allow players to explore freely without running into areas that were overwhelmingly difficult. But the result was kind of complicated because in earlier Elder Scrolls games, part of the experience was learning where you didn't belong yet. Certain areas were dangerous, certain enemies were overwhelming, and that created a natural sense of progression. You literally had to grow into the world. And with Oblivion, that structure was very much softened. The world adjusted to you instead of you adapting to it. And while that made the game more approachable, it also changed how players perceived the world itself. You know, bandits could appear wearing high level equipment. Creatures that once felt dangerous became routine as the world adjusted around you. And for some players, that created this sense that the world wasn't existing independently, but rather reacting specifically to them. So it took away a little bit from the living, breathing world concept. Now, that was not by accident. That wasn't just happenstance. That was a deliberate design choice tied to Bethesda's broader goal, right? They wanted to make the experience more accessible to a wider audience. That's how you do it. But for longtime fans of the series, those changes felt like the series was being streamlined at the expense of what made it unique. That divide became one of the defining conversations around Oblivion. Not whether or not it was successful, because it was, but rather about what kind of role playing game it was becoming, and most importantly, for a lot of people, what that meant for the future of the series. On top of that, Oblivion also became part of another shift that was happening in the industry at the time. It's infamous shift. Because in 2006, console gaming was just beginning to experiment with something that would soon become standard, and that was downloadable content. Hard to believe that 20 years is about you. We've had 20 years of downloadable content, right?
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that long.
Oblivion found itself right in the center of that moment, right in the center of the introduction of DLC. Because shortly after launch, they released a small piece of downloadable content, the infamous horse armor. Do you remember the horse armor?
I didn't play enough Oblivion to know about the horse armor, Dave.
The horse armor made headlines at the time. It was priced at $2.50, and all it was cosmetic armor that you could apply to your horse.
I mean, that's still pretty sick.
Uh, but here's the thing, it was a visual upgrade for $2.50 at a time when there were no visual upgrades for $2.50. We were all up in arms that a company had the gall, the audacity to charge us $2.50 for horse armor that added
You,
nothing to the game.
but Dave, you didn't need it.
No, you didn't need it. And that was a valid point. That was a valid point. That was part of the conversation, right? Because we were all questioning the value of paid content that didn't meaningfully expand the game at the time. And here we are in the beginning with horse armor. And really, it's one of the earliest widely recognized controversies surrounding DLC on consoles. In hindsight, it marked the beginning of something much larger, right? We're talking about it now because 250 for cosmetic skin is cheap, to be honest with you, right?
Yeah, definitely nowadays it is.
I mean, let's be honest about that. That's very reasonably priced now. Like, yes, please give me horse armor for 250. But it wasn't at the time, and I think that's important to remember. You know,
No, that's definitely fair.
at the time, horse armor was mocked. But the reality is that that model didn't go away in any way, shape, or form. Horse armor was just the earliest, one of the earliest widely recognized pieces of downloadable content where we were all questioning what the heck is downloadable content.
Well, we
Luckily,
learned real
horse
quick.
we learned real quick. Yes, I mean, 20 years ago, free to play wasn't even a thing. You know, like this was literally this is literally when all those systems were being developed. Like this was the beginning. We've had 20 years of those gameplay systems and everything, you know, that that have been across the industry. So it was a different time, different place. Horse Armor wasn't the full story of Oblivion's downloadable content because as strange as that first release was, what came next was more or less a proper showing of what downloadable content could actually become, or if you ask anyone's opinion, probably what downloadable content should actually become. Later on in 2006, Bethesda released Knights of the Nine, a story driven expansion that added a full quest line centered around a fallen order of knights. It came with new locations and items and a structured narrative that players could follow from beginning to end. And then in 2007 came to Shivering Isles. And the Shivering Isles wasn't just an add on, it was an entirely new world. Shivering Isles is set within the realm of Sheogorath, the Daedric Prince of Madness. The Shivering Isles introduced a landscape that was completely different from Cyrodiil, where Oblivion was set. It had twisted geography and surreal architecture and a tone that just leaned completely into unpredictability and instability. And I think most importantly, Shivering Isles showed something about Bethesda's approach to content. Because while Oblivion moved them more so towards accessibility and structure, the Shivering Isles was very much more of that old feeling where Bethesda was experimenting again. It was strange. It was stylized. It was like Morrowind's giant insect creatures that could take you around places. It reminded players of that kind of creativity that they loved about Morrowind. Because of that, it was very well received. It is often cited as one of the best expansions of that era. And taken together, Oblivion's downloadable content tells a much bigger story than Horse Armor ever could. Because on one end, you have those small cosmetic purchases, the content that players question almost immediately, and on the other, you have full scale expansions, right? New worlds, new systems, and new stories that players embraced. These are two completely different ideas that are existing side by side. And again, that's commonplace now, this is happening at the moment when the industry is just figuring out what downloadable content could be. And in a lot of ways, Bethesda was writing the manual on what that should look like for other companies. And what they came up with was that downloadable content is not just content, but a spectrum, right? From something as small as armor for a horse to something as large as an entirely new world to explore. And then there's one more piece of Oblivion's legacy that didn't come from Bethesda alone. Alongside the game, Bethesda released the Elder Scrolls Construction Set, a set of tools that allowed players to create their own content inside the world of Oblivion. So players could make their, new quests and new items. There could they could come up with entirely new systems layered on top of what was already there, and almost immediately players started using it. What began as small tweaks, such as stat adjustments and item additions, bug fixes even, quickly grew into something much larger. There were entire quest lines created. People were building completely new worlds. Systems were reworked. As a result, communities formed around the construction set. Sites like the Elder Scrolls Nexus became central hubs where players could share, download, and collaborate on mods, turning Oblivion into something that kept evolving long after its original release. And over time, that community didn't just sustain the game, it expanded what people expected from it. Because Oblivion didn't just give players a world to explore, it also gave them the tools to reshape it. And I think it's important to recognize that because in doing so, Bethesda helped solidify something that would be a defining part of their identity going forward. Their games weren't just experiences from that point on. They were platforms upon which communities could participate and shape in themselves. In the years that followed, the same community would help carry that idea even further, of course, when Skyrim, the sequel Rob referenced, arrived in 2011. That modding culture didn't just return, it absolutely exploded. Modding was a huge part of Skyrim's identity. Again, that culture that started here with Oblivion just kind of blew up and took off with Skyrim. We covered that in depth in episode 11. So if you want to see just how big that community becomes, go check out that episode in our archives. If you'd like to learn more about the Elder Scrolls series, we talked about the early history of Bethesda again and the origin of the series in episode 187. And if you'd like to revisit the previous game in the series, Morrowind, we covered its entire history in episode 244. You can, of course, find these episodes and many more by going to our website at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our future episode topics Noah will be talking about in the coming weeks. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I can be found on several platforms as Rob underscore O underscore Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've even covered a few places here and there. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find new things, weird things, interesting things, things you might not know about your favorite games. And it's exciting to share those with you. It's a fantastic cycle of teaching and learning, learning and teaching. And in celebration of said cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, Dave, I had always heard a little bit about the characters, the NPCs in the game, and how they had a life of all their own, but I did not realize the sheer depth of it. And the Radiant AI is just mind boggling to me. The fact that they were poisoning each other and it initially developed, or it initially caused an entire town to erupt into chaos.
Yeah.
I I mean, it just reminds me of Grand Theft Auto. Speaking back on how you mentioned Grand Theft Auto was a thing, when you did the crazy pedestrians cheat or something like that,
Yeah.
where it corrupted your save file and everyone was just crazy and beating the shit out of each other, and that's cool to me. That's something that this was originally designed into the game, that they could live their lives and that it could eventually turn into chaos.
Isn't it cool when you think about the detail that goes into creating worlds like this, right? In specific reference to Radiant AI. Like it's so cool when you stop and you think about it from the design perspective because you have Morrowind where an NPC was standing in place and was just reciting dialogue. And then you want to kick that up a notch, right? You want to develop a world where it feels alive. And when you develop your AI for your NPCs, your next one could be okay, I'm going to put this NPC in this house and make him walk around the house or make him walk this path or, you know, react to this. Like you can do simple things. Or you can develop systems like Radiant AI where you give them their needs. I'm hungry, I'm poor, I'm rich, I have to have a job, I have a family. Like you literally give them their goals in life and you say, "Okay, off you go." I mean, I know that they have to power that down to you can't leave this area type instance, but it's really cool when you stop and you think about what AI genuinely is in these situations and not the, AI chatbots that everyone's, you know, frustrated about these days.
No, absolutely. It's really cool to think on that. But that's my big takeaway. What about yourself, Dave?
I enjoyed the comparison because Oblivion was quite literally a response to Morrowind. They heard all the feedback, heard all the criticism, and they said, okay, point by point, we're going to take it all to heart and we're going to redesign these systems to make it even better. And I've never thought about Oblivion that way. I've never thought before about the reasons why Oblivion took to me and they didn't take why I've never ever been able to get into Morrowind. Although that being said, I should try it again. I could probably get into it now. But at the time, how I gave up on Morrowind, right? And
Right.
when you think about the changes, it makes more sense because I'm not a hardcore at anything. Let's just be honest about that. I don't play on hard mode. I don't. I don't role play. I'm not a hardcore gamer. I'm not. I mean, I'm not easy peasy casual. I fit somewhere in the middle. Like I think mainstream gamer is a very fair assessment of what I am. Right. I like to play everything, but it needs to be accessible. Needs to guide my hand a little bit because I don't have the time or patience for it.
True.
So when you look at the two games together, now and I learn about it from the design perspective, it makes a lot more sense to me. Like it's very logical why I was able to play Oblivion and why I've never been able to pick up Morrowind. It's really neat making, I love making connections like that. So that was fun to do.
Right on.
All right, Rob. Well, before I take it out, wrap up this episode and take us into next week, is there anything you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll take one quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us to have you along on this journey as we live our lives in chaos. So thank you.
Sometimes progress isn't about adding more. Sometimes it's about deciding what to change and deciding what you're willing to leave behind, right? Because every creative decision comes with a trade off. You make something deeper and you risk losing people. You make something more accessible and you risk losing what made it special in the first place. And to be fair, that tension isn't unique to games, right? It shows up in art, in technology, and storytelling. Anytime something grows from a niche idea into something meant from a wider audience, this is a consideration. Oblivion sits right in the middle of such a moment. It took everything Bethesda had been building toward, right? Freedom, scale, player choice, and reshaped it into something that more players could experience. And in doing so, it didn't just define a generation of role playing games, it helped redefine what those games could be as a whole. It marked a shift in how those worlds were built and who they were built for and how players experienced them. Oblivion didn't just expand the audience for the Elder Scrolls, it literally helped define what a modern open world role playing game could look like. And that influence didn't stop there. The series continued to grow through Skyrim, the audience got bigger, the worlds became even more expansive. Heck, now we've got what, Starfield, and we're in the universe. Same concept, right?
True.
And the ideas introduced here, accessibility and systemic design, living worlds, those all became part of the foundation of these games moving forward. And I think that's what makes Oblivion so important in the Elder Scrolls series. It's not just because of what it was, but more so because of what it set into motion. Because in 2006, Oblivion didn't just open the gates to a new world, it helped shape the direction of every world that came after it. Next week, we are stepping away from sprawling open worlds and moving into something a little more personal. Released in 2001, Black and White put players in the role of a god, not just in reshaping the land, but also influencing the lives of the people who lived within it. You could rule with kindness or fear. You could guide your followers or control them. But the real question wasn't what you could do, it was what you chose to do. So join us as we explore how Black and White blurred the lines between simulation, morality, and player choice on next week's trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Dooba-doom dap dap dum doo up doo up up doo up bow.